Something happened in the California desert on Sunday night that nobody saw coming, and if you were not paying close attention you might have missed the single moment that completely redefined the trajectory of the entire 2026 WTA season, because inside Stadium 1 at the BNP Paribas Open in Indian Wells, underneath those blazing stadium lights with over 16,000 fans packed into every corner of the second largest tennis stadium on the planet, the world number 4 Coco Gauff, one of the most physically imposing and mentally resilient competitors the sport has produced in a generation, walked to the net after just 54 minutes of play, wrapped her arms around her opponent, whispered an apology loud enough for courtside microphones to capture, and retired from the match. And standing on the other side of that net was 20-year-old Alexandra Eala from the Philippines, not celebrating, not screaming, not pumping her fist toward the sky, but crying, genuinely crying tears of empathy for the player she had just defeated. And that image, that collision of heartbreak and humanity, of physical collapse and emotional grace, is precisely why this night will live in the memory of tennis fans from Manila to Miami for years and years to come. Now, before we unpack every layer of what happened inside that stadium, we need to establish the context that makes this result so seismic, because the story of this match does not begin in Indian Wells. It begins several weeks earlier in Dubai, where these exact two players faced each other in the quarterfinals of the Dubai Tennis Championships, and what unfolded there was not a contest, it was a demonstration. Gauff dismantled Eala 6-love 6-2 in what looked like a completely routine victory for the American, a masterclass in baseline dominance that made the gap between an established elite player and a rising young talent look vast and perhaps insurmountable in the short term. And after that performance, the consensus among analysts and fans was straightforward: Gauff was the finished product. The two-time Grand Slam champion with over 400 professional matches behind her, who had retired from a match only once in her entire career, back in Cincinnati in 2022, and Eala was the promising prospect, the exciting young Filipino player still navigating the enormous physical and psychological demands of life on the professional tour. So when the Indian Wells draw threw them together again in the third round barely weeks later, the expectation was clear: Gauff would be efficient, Gauff would be dominant, and Gauff would move into the second week of the tournament without too much drama. But tennis has always had a magnificent habit of tearing up every script written for it and starting completely from scratch. The atmosphere that built inside Stadium 1 before that first ball was struck was something genuinely extraordinary, and you have to understand what was happening in those stands to appreciate the full texture of this night, because the Filipino community in Southern California mobilized in a way that transformed an American tennis tournament into something that felt like a home match for Eala. They were everywhere. Flags draped over railings, chants rising from every section, a wall of noise and color that effectively neutralized whatever home crowd energy Gauff might have drawn upon. And that kind of passionate collective support does not just lift the player it is cheering for, it quietly and persistently weighs on the opponent. It changes the emotional mathematics of every big point. And from the very first rally it was evident that the Eala who stepped onto that court was a fundamentally different player from the one who had been dismantled in Dubai. She moved with purpose. She struck the ball cleanly. She dictated the rhythm of exchanges rather than simply absorbing whatever Gauff chose to throw at her. And there was a tactical intelligence to her game that had clearly been sharpened and refined in the weeks since that Dubai defeat. The game plan Eala and her coaching team had constructed for this match deserves genuine admiration, because rather than trying to match Gauff's raw power shot for shot, which would have been a losing strategy for almost anyone on the tour, Eala built her approach around disruption and variety. She used the slightly slower courts at Indian Wells to absorb Gauff's pace and redirect it. She kept the ball extraordinarily deep when rallying from the baseline and then suddenly pulled Gauff forward with beautifully disguised drop shots that made the court feel enormous and forced the American to move up and down rather than simply grinding horizontally from side to side. And crucially, she attacked Gauff's second serve with real aggression, stepping inside the baseline and taking the ball early to seize control of points before Gauff could establish her preferred baseline position. And this was a strategically devastating choice given the statistical reality of Gauff's serving in 2026. Because the numbers coming into this tournament were genuinely alarming for a player of her caliber. She was converting only 38% of her second serve points, Her ace rate had declined sharply, and across multiple matches earlier in the season she had produced double fault tallies that no top 5 player should be accumulating, suggesting that something was not functioning correctly in either the mechanics or the physical foundation of her serve, and Eala's team had done their homework and built their entire tactical framework around exploiting exactly that vulnerability from the opening game. For a while, as the first set developed, it genuinely looked as though the Dubai outcome might simply repeat itself. Gauff moved ahead and there were moments where her quality shone through, but then at 5-2 down in the opening set, Gauff raised her hand and called for the trainer, and what followed was a lengthy and deeply uncomfortable medical timeout during which a physio worked extensively on her left forearm and shoulder, applying heavy strapping while the crowd sat in a tense and worried silence, and you could see from even a television broadcast the visible discomfort on Gauff's face, the wince when she attempted a practice serve, the way she held and examined that left arm between points, and to understand why this specific injury is so crippling for a player of Gauff's style, you need to appreciate the biomechanical role the left arm plays in tennis for a right-handed player, because it is not some secondary passive limb simply along for the ride, it is absolutely central to two of the most important shots on the court. When you serve, the left arm controls the ball toss entirely, and if there is nerve inflammation or tendon damage in that arm, your toss becomes inconsistent and unpredictable. An inconsistent toss shatters the kinetic chain of the entire serving motion, you lose the ability to generate reliable pace, your accuracy disappears, and double faults begin to accumulate, not because your technique has failed you but because the physical infrastructure supporting the motion has been compromised from the ground up. And then on the two-handed backhand, which is arguably the most important and destructive weapon in Gauff's entire arsenal, the left arm does a significant amount of the driving and guiding through the contact zone. It absorbs the shock generated by heavy incoming balls, it shapes the direction of the shot, and if every single backhand you attempt sends a sharp shooting pain through your forearm or shoulder, then continuing to compete at the level required to beat a top 20 opponent becomes not just difficult but physiologically impossible over any sustained period of time. The courage Gauff showed in stepping back onto the court after that medical timeout was genuine and the crowd recognized it, but the structural damage to her game was already too severe to overcome through willpower alone. The double faults kept coming, the backhands softened noticeably, and Eala, to her immense credit, handled the entirely unpredictable environment on the other side of the net with a composure that was frankly remarkable for a 20-year-old in the biggest match of her career. She did not tighten up when Gauff took that lengthy timeout. She did not start playing tentatively or waiting for her opponent to fall apart. She kept executing her game plan with precision and focus. She served well, she attacked weak returns, she stayed completely present in every single point, and she closed out the first set 6-2. And when the second set began 2 games in at 2-love in Eala's favor, Gauff looked at her box, looked at her arm, and made the decision that every fierce competitor dreads but that every intelligent athlete eventually recognizes as necessary. She walked to the net and she retired, and what happened in those few seconds became the defining image of the entire night. Because she hugged Eala and apologized to her. She said, "I'm sorry, I hate to do this." And those words coming from the player who was in physical agony rather than the player who was advancing reveal something essential about Gauff's character and her understanding of what sport means. At its deepest level, she was concerned about Eala's experience in that moment despite the pain she herself was feeling, and Eala's response was the mirror image of that grace. There was no celebration, there were only tears. And in her post-match interview she was completely honest. She said she really didn't want to win this way. She praised Gauff as an amazing competitor and role model. She connected the moment to International Women's Day and spoke about how players like Gauff, who have navigated the crushing weight of global expectations since their teenage years, make it possible for younger players to believe they deserve to be on these stages. And hearing that kind of emotional intelligence and genuine respect from a 20-year-old standing in the spotlight of the biggest result of her career was something that transcended sport entirely. The cultural significance of what Eala achieved in that stadium cannot be overstated, because for the Philippines this is not simply a tennis result. It is a historic moment that will reverberate through the country's sporting culture for a generation. The Philippines has traditionally channeled its athletic identity through basketball and boxing. And to have a young Filipino woman breaking into the fourth round of a WTA 1000 event, standing on one of the biggest stages in world tennis and winning, is something genuinely unprecedented. Eala is not just accumulating ranking points. She is reshaping what Filipino athletes believe is achievable in a sport that has historically demanded enormous financial resources and infrastructure that many developing tennis nations simply do not have access to, and the fans who filled Stadium 1 that night understood exactly what they were witnessing. They were not just cheering for a tennis player, they were celebrating the fracturing of a ceiling that had never been cracked before. And when Eala addressed them in Tagalog after the match, the eruption of noise that came back from those stands was the kind of raw collective joy that you cannot manufacture or stage. It was completely real and completely earned. Her path to this moment has demanded years of sacrifice and relentless work. Training at the Rafael Nadal Academy in Mallorca has given her not just technical refinement but the specific mental framework that defines Nadal's entire competitive philosophy. The deep belief that you fight for every point regardless of the scoreboard, that you embrace suffering as part of the process rather than retreating from it, and that composure in chaos is a skill that can be developed and practiced just like any other, and you could see every element of that education in how she performed across this entire Indian Wells campaign. She arrived in the Gauff match having already survived a brutal nearly 3-hour battle against Diana Schneider in the previous round. A match that would have left most players at her level emotionally and physically depleted. And yet she produced one of the most tactically sophisticated and mentally composed performances of her young career against one of the top 5 players in the world. That does not happen by accident. That is the result of years of deliberate preparation and a competitive mindset that has been carefully built over a long period of time. For Gauff, the road ahead is complicated and genuinely uncertain. The immediate priority is understanding exactly what has happened in that left arm, whether the issue lies in the forearm, the shoulder, or the nerve pathways connecting them, and whether it represents a short-term problem that responds to rest and treatment or something more structurally serious that demands extended rehabilitation. The timing makes everything more difficult because the Miami Open is less than 2 weeks away and Miami is Gauff's home state tournament, a competition she cares about deeply and where she has a meaningful competitive history. The temptation to return quickly will be real, but the risk of aggravating a serious injury by rushing back would be far greater than the cost of missing a single tournament. And then beyond Miami sits the clay court season, where the pressure intensifies even further. Gauff is a genuine Roland Garros contender, a former finalist and champion on the surface, and missing significant preparation time on clay due to an arm injury that potentially also requires mechanical adjustments to her service motion midseason is precisely the kind of compounding problem that can derail an entire year's ambitions if it is not managed with absolute patience and care. As the desert swing continues and as Eala prepares to face Linda Noskova in the 4th round, the question the entire tennis world is now asking is whether Sunday night was an isolated breakthrough or the first page of a much longer story, because if Eala continues to perform with the tactical intelligence and emotional composure she showed against Gauff, the conversation around her will shift very quickly from rising prospect to legitimate contender. And for the Filipino fans who stayed up through every time zone across Southeast Asia to follow this tournament, that possibility alone makes the desert nights in California feel like the beginning of something genuinely historic.